Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou I said art sure no craven. Ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore, tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe had a very sad and interesting life. His life was just as grim and lonely as many of his works of writing. And if you aren't familiar with them, all of his writing is mysterious, sad. He's been called the father of the modern mystery, the father of the short story. He's been very successful, but all of his writing is pretty creepy, I guess. Ever since I was a young girl, I've been intrigued with him. It wasn't until I was older that I actually learned that his life was pretty devastating itself. There is so much that happened in Edgar Allan Poe's life that I'd like to talk about, the main points in his early, mid, and later life, and also his death. Poe's young life was no walk in the park. The tragedy that was his life started when he was only 1. His father deserted the family, David Poe deserted the family a year after Edgar Allan Poe was born, and his mother had died of tuberculosis when he was only 3. And then his father eventually died also very shortly after, when he was 27. And once they both died, Edgar Allan Poe was separated from his siblings, William Henry and Rosalie, and he was sent to Richmond, Virginia, to live with a foster family. Their names were Francis and John Allen. They were very successful in the tobacco market. They changed his name to Edgar Allan. They raised him as their own, but they never legally adopted him. He ended up going to England, which this part of his life actually wasn't that sad, which makes me happy for him, but he went to England from 1815 to 1820, and then they ended up returning to Richmond when the tobacco market in England collapsed. In 1824, the Allens tobacco firm actually failed, and it caused a lot of money issues with Edgar and his foster father, John. He was attending the University of Virginia, and John decided that he was only going to pay the minimum amount, and so Edgar began gambling and drinking, and this is when his drinking problem started. And John decided that he was not going to recognize that debt, and Poe ended up dropping out not even a year after he had started there. He eventually joined the army and went to West Point. He reconnected with John Allen to get a connection at West Point, actually, and they were actually on good terms for a little bit. John's wife, Frances, died when he was at West Point, and Edgar at that point was doing amazing scholarly. And then John remarried without telling Poe, and they say that he stopped doing his duties because he wanted to spite John, and he got kicked out of West Point. That's when they cut ties. Edgar still expected that he was going to be in John's will, and he was not. He was left out completely, but John did take care of one of his illegitimate children, which upset Poe deeply because he was raised as their child his whole life. And then after he got kicked out of West Point, he moved to Baltimore, and he became a critic. They called him the Tomahawk Man. He was very harsh with people's writings. He didn't care what people thought of him, and there wasn't very many good reviews that he gave, and he started publishing more recognizable pieces like Tamerlane and the House of Usher, The Fall of the House of Usher, and The Raven. And just when things started going right for Edgar, they all seemed to fall apart. His later life and death, they kind of get a little foggy because there's a lot of rumors that were thrown around. He ended up moving in with his aunt and her daughter, Virginia. He ended up marrying his 13-year-old cousin when he was nearly 30, and he did it in secret at first in Baltimore, and then there was a public marriage in Richmond a year later. She ended up dying of tuberculosis at the same age his mother did, and he ended up floating around cities until he died. His death is somewhat of a mystery, and because he was on his way to Richmond, and he was found in a kind of hysterious state. He was semi-conscious and died 3 days later, and the official cause was congestion of the brain. But right after he died, one of his friends actually wrote a biography that kind of slandered him completely. People believed that he was crazy, and he basically, it wasn't until years later that he was actually recognized as a good author, and he was one of the if you have not read any of his stories, you wouldn't understand the irony that was his life. But his life ended just as tragically as it began, and almost every story he wrote was a tragedy. So it's pretty amazing to me. But the story of Edgar Allan Poe is a sad but accomplished one. He, like I said, he's called the father of the modern mystery, and the father of short stories. He was one of the first authors that was world-renowned. There was actually one guy who spent 20 years of his life translating all of Poe's work into French. But his stories and poems, they were all grim and sad, and it's no wonder that he was so successful in writing these types of stories, because his life was just as sad. He struggled financially his entire life. He lost his parents, he lost his wife. It's almost like he wasn't meant to be happy, but many people tend to write about their experiences in one way or another. But Edgar Allan Poe's life was almost hard to believe, and it's just an amazing thing to me that even years later, centuries later, he is still as well known as more well known now than he was when he was actually alive, and that's just an amazing thing to me. Thank you.